Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Grossman Files. Hey, we got a great one for you today. Yes, we got a great one for you today. Thanks, everyone, for being out here in the Grossman world. I really appreciate it. We're doing one of these brief little sojourns into what I like to do every now and then. Well, another topic that interests me. I mean, and of course that my hope is that it interests you as well. So what are we doing? Well, we're starting a two-part series on the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery. And why are we doing this? As I say hello to all my friends out there in chat land. Well, last week my sister sent me an article from the New York Times. Yeah, I know, the New York Times, but listen, even a broken clock is right twice a day, all right? And I was absolutely so blown away by this article by a masterful writer named Andrew Keh, Keh, about a mystery woman buried at the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery that I immediately became obsessed with the story and, of course, now want to bring it to you guys. So today we're going to learn a little bit about the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery. We are going to read the article together, look at some pictures, hopefully get you into this story, invested in it enough for the upcoming walk and talk at the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery. Yes, I've hooked it up. It's going down. Going to walk around the grounds with my man Ed Martin III, and we're going to bring this story to life, no pun intended. But we're hopefully gonna have a great time. So anyway, we got quite a bit to do today in this live stream portion of this two-part series on the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery. And of course, the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery is a place that I've driven by now. I mean, geez, my parents used to drive me by there all the time because it's on Central Avenue. In fact, let's take a look at where this place resides in the so-called world. Give me a second here. All right. Well, now, of course, we're looking at the county of Westchester, and Westchester County, for all y'all out there in Son of Sam land, this is old news to you. You guys are experts in Westchester County at this point, okay? Because we've been dealing with Yonkers, with New Rochelle, and so on and so forth. But Westchester County is actually quite huge. It encompasses all the way up to here, Mount Kisco, up to near Yorktown Heights. So it's this entire section that I'm circling. Give me a second here, just make sure. And of course, the Pet Cemetery lies just south to almost center of the county here on what is now a very commercial strip. It's starting to come into focus here, and you can see this long strip of road. This is the famous Central Avenue. And of course, Central Avenue is well known to anybody who lives in the North Bronx like I do, and in Southern Westchester, like so many of y'all out there do. Central Avenue was the place to go. It was where all the stores were and still are to this day. It was where Tower Records was, the car dealerships, the restaurants, the movie theaters, the Caldors back in the day. Central Avenue was the bomb, okay? And it basically runs from Yonkers all the way up to White Plains up here, where it terminates at what's called the county center. But the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, I've been seeing it ever since I'm a little boy, because my parents always took us up shopping on Central Avenue. It was one of the places. You know, I'm no stranger to Yonkers, despite what people think. Basically grew up in that town, just like I grew up in Riverdale. And so let's just get to like more 3D. And so you can kind of see here now where the Pet Cemetery resides, which is right over here. It's actually really not that big a piece of land. And I just remember always driving by this as a kid and going, Pet Cemetery. Wow, that's cool. People bury their pets. They must really love their pets. We weren't really a huge pet family. We didn't have a dog. We had cats. And when they died, we just buried them in the woods or the backyard. We never even considered putting our pets in a cemetery, but apparently a lot of people do, and you can see it here. And I've always been intrigued by this place. So, of course, this article about the mystery woman buried at the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery really is great for me, because now I have an excuse to dive into to do a much bigger deep dive into this place. And so you can see it here, the Hartsdale Canine Cemetery, on this big commercial strip called Central Avenue. And of course, every town in America has a Central Avenue, and quite often they're all the same. They're the place where you went for your commerce as a kid. So I'm gonna just get out of this street view here, and we're gonna take it over here, and I am actually going to read you the history of this place as we sort of look at it, different views, and so on and so forth. Give me a sec here. So the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery was founded in 1896 to address the growing need for a secure and dignified resting place for the pets of New York City. The idea of a burial ground for animals patterned after those catering to people was first proposed by Emily Berthoud, an accomplished equestrian and liberated, quote, new woman. To realize her dream, she partnered with Dr. Samuel Johnson, Manhattan's preeminent veterinary surgeon and proprietor of the first state-of-the-art hospital for animals in the city. Emily's estate of 5 hillside acres in the village of Hartsdale, just 20 minutes north of the city by train, presented the ideal location, and Dr. Johnson, with his brilliant business acumen and clientele of devout pet owners, was the perfect individual to steward the revolutionary endeavor. Today, the beautiful hillside location known as the Peaceable Kingdom is the final resting place for more than 80,000 dogs, cats, rabbits, birds, reptiles, monkeys, and even a lion cub that lived at the Plaza Hotel with the Russian princess, as well as the cremains of a full-grown Bengal tiger that grew up in an apartment in Harlem, New York. So this place is registered on the National Historic Register, and of course you can see here in this particular view how it is indeed a pretty steep hill going up. Let's get back down to the street view, where you can see how it elevates quite a bit. And so we'll be walking around there. We're going to be showing all sorts of fun gravestones, because look, I mean, it's a cemetery, but we're into it. I mean, I love gravestones. I love reading them. I find them incredibly interesting. I'm looking really forward to walking around this place with Ed Martin III, and hopefully he'll show us some of the his favorite resting places and interesting headstones, and of course give us the inside story on this woman named Patricia Chaarte, the mystery woman who was buried at the Hartsdale Cemetery. And so that's the topic for today. All right, so let me get my slideshow up while you guys just chill here for a second. And of course, I was reading the history taken directly from the website of the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery. And here's a better picture of the front gate, founded in 1896. So when we walk around with Ed, we'll get the history of the place, we'll get the inside scoop on all that. But let's get into the story. Well, of course, some amazing pictures here of the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, and of course, those of you who this might evoke feelings of Stephen King, and that book has to come up when you're talking about pet cemeteries, especially to those of us who are fans of the old Stephen King, the cool Stephen King. And Pet Cemetery was an amazing book, and this really evoked it for me because of just the way that just the pure visuals here. And it's actually quite a beautiful place, as we see here some form of cherry tree, possibly, or a red bud. That might be, I think that, no, that's actually a red bud. Cercis canadensis. So Nico's Moss is talking about the Ramones song. Yeah, Pet Cemetery. The movie, as always, movies of Stephen King are never as good as the book. But that was a decent movie. And it was an amazing Stephen King book, not to get on another tangent here, but 11/22/63. I mean, what an amazing book. Unbelievably cool concept of a guy who can go back in time and stop the assassination of Kennedy, and then what happens after that because he does that. Really great book. It's 1,000 pages, but it's really a page turner. I read it twice in just a couple days. It was that good. So here we see Spanky Geller, 1983 to 1998. You will always be my baby, my best friend, and my love. And there we see old Spanky Geller. Of course, for all y'all heads out there, we got my Sam, 69 to 1984, and he was simply the best. We got Mittens Monaco, who lived from 1954 to 1970. Dear God, please give Mittens your love. She gave so much of hers. Teresa Monaco, DO82. Now, DO82. I wonder if Teresa is buried here as well. And the reason why I asked that is because, of course, we're going to learn today in this amazing article from the New York Times written by Andrew Keh. And please give me a second. The phone is ringing. I didn't take it to the other room. Please give me 10 seconds while I take care of this issue. Sorry, that was more like 20 seconds. But anyway, as we're going to learn today, people are buried there. It's that blew me away when I learned that. I don't know why. I don't know why I never thought about that. But then again, who thinks about pet cemeteries? I mean, the only time really you should think about cemeteries is if, well, you're really into the topic. But if someone is dying and you need to go, it's like, why would I go to a cemetery unless I have to, right? But actually, no, that's not the case. They're actually the history of cemeteries in America is quite rich. Actually, they were the original landscape parks. A lot of our places like New York Botanical Gardens and BBG and all these amazing botanical gardens, really, and Central Park and so on. That whole idea of the city park came out of the cemetery landscaping movement of the 1800s. Cemeteries were considered places to go to recreate, and the old headstones are actually quite amazing to read. So I joke about certain things, but we do appreciate the history of cemeteries here. So here's joie de vie, joy. 5 June from 59 to 13 October 73. Must have been a French. The joy and happiness you brought in our lives will never be forgotten. Mommy and Daddy, Laura, Ray Johnson, and Alex. And of course, here we see Joie de Vie with her or his very, very loving owner. And of course, Ming, the tiger of Harlem. Some of you may remember this story of a tiger that they found in Harlem. It was a freaking crazy story in New York City, where this thing was just living in an apartment. Ming the tiger. So Ming the tiger is buried at the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, and you know that we're gonna go take a look at this grave. I want Ed to, if he's watching, I want Ed, get your favorite and most interesting gravestones ready and get those stories and ready, because we want to absorb as much as you can possibly put out on this place. Really, really looking forward to meeting you. So Ming the tiger is buried there. And so we should now sort of introduce this story by Andrew Keh in the New York Times. So this is a masterful piece of writing. I tried to reach out to this guy, but like for some reason you can't send messages on his various social media. You have to pay to be certain. I didn't even want to bother. I figure if this dude is really interested, he'll eventually find this video and reach out to me, because I'd actually love to talk to him about the genesis of this article. But it really hit my heart like very few things I've read in the past 15 to 20 years. And so I want to just read it to you guys, because this is sort of what this little mini series we're doing on the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery is all about. It's about this mystery woman buried there and her story, and how interesting her story weaves in with the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery as the backdrop. It's just a masterful piece of writing, a great story, and I feel very privileged and honored to be able to bring it to life to you in any way that I can. So we're going to oh yay, Ed's in the crowd. So this Ed Martin III, you're going to be seeing some pictures of him when we read the article, and very much looking forward to meeting you. And of course, thanks for being here today. So I think the best thing to do is for me to just read this to you and not even comment, because the story speaks for itself. And then I'll just sort of read the chat at the end, see if there's any questions, because I'm going to get so into it, I'm not even going to look at the chat. And hopefully this is a little introduction for you guys. If you're into this story, knowing this story and having it absorb into your psyche is going to make the walk and talk so much richer. So that's kind of what we're going for here and why we're doing this live stream today. So let us just get relaxed, everybody. I know the Mets and the Yankees are playing. I'm looking forward to watching it myself. But relax and enjoy and open your mind for really what a story that absolutely shook me to the core in terms of its just sheer power. And hopefully you'll feel the same way. So this was written in January of 2024. At Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, Ed Martin III had become accustomed to unusual requests. Then came Patricia Chaarte. Andrew Keh, January 7th, 2024. Give me a second. Ed Martin III was 14 years old when he began working at his father's pet cemetery, and in the decades since, he has tended to the graves of innumerable dogs, many cats, flocks of birds, a few monkeys, a lion cub, a Bengal tiger, and countless other creatures from every corner of the animal kingdom. In all that time, after all those burials, there was only ever one request a few years ago that gave him pause. Calling that morning on January 29th, 2020, was Bruce Johnson, a lawyer from New York, who had in his possession the cremated remains of a woman named Patricia Chaarte. Mrs. Chaarte had died at her home in Mexico at the age of 92. In her will, she had requested that her ashes be interred at Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, just north of New York City. She had no next of kin. The executive of her estate was not a family member or friend, but merely another lawyer at the firm. There were no further instructions. The thought of burying a human at a pet cemetery for Mr. Martin was not in itself particularly confounding. Alongside the 80,000 or so animals currently interred at his family's graveyard are approximately 900 people, including all 4 of his grandparents, who wished to rest eternally with their pets. In dealing each day with the emotionally convoluted rigors of his job, Mr. Martin, now 57, had become attuned to the various human compulsions around the ritual of death. Prominent among them, for many, is the desire for a level of physical proximity to loved ones, animals included, even after one soul has departed. But this case felt different. Mrs. Chaarte, in death, seemed so alone. Please let me know what is involved in purchasing a place of rest for the decedent, and then we will probably arrange to have the remains shipped directly to you, Mr. Johnson wrote with lawyerly formality in an email later that day. There will be no funeral or burial ceremony. Sitting at his desk, Mr. Martin felt both bewildered and sad. Who was this woman who had died more than 2,000 miles away? Why would she be laid to rest at a pet cemetery, all alone? A cemetery ahead of its time. And here's Ed Martin III, a man who we're going to be walking around the cemetery with. Hartsdale Pet Cemetery was founded almost by chance in 1896 when a prominent Manhattan veterinarian named Samuel K. Johnson allowed a grieving client to bury her dog at his Westchester apple orchard. It was not very long before pet owners began asking to be buried there too, with records showing human burials in the cemetery as early as the 1920s. The cemetery was the first of its kind in the United States, and in some sense, it was ahead of its time. As Americans grew increasingly pet obsessed, the pet burial industry took off. Today, two-thirds of households in the United States have pets, and Americans collectively spend more than 100 billion each year taking care of them. There are now hundreds of pet cemeteries nationwide. But Hartsdale remains the most prominent one, with scores of famous pets like Ming, the 400-pound tiger discovered in a Manhattan apartment in 2003, and a few pets of famous people like Mariah Carey, whose beloved cat Clarence died in 1997. My eternal friend and guardian angel, Mrs. Carey's inscription on her cat's gravestone reads, "You'll always be a part of me forever. Love, M." Human burials were carried out without issue until 2011, when the cemetery received a cease and desist order from the New York Division of Cemeteries, which had become aware of an increase in the practice. The resulting backlash from pet owners, though, was swift, and the state quickly established new rules formally allowing human burials in pet cemeteries to continue, with a couple of stipulations. The cemeteries could not advertise them, nor charge a fee. These days, Hartsdale buries about 300 animals and half a dozen humans per year. Mr. Martin, who began working at the cemetery in 1980, was slow at first to embrace the family's business. His father, Edward Martin Jr., purchased the graveyard with a friend in 1974, and back then, Ed Martin III found it all a bit embarrassing. The arrival in 1983 of Stephen King's Pet Cemetery did not help. "All my friends' parents were doctors and lawyers and Wall Street people," Mr. Martin said. He started working at the graveyard as a teenager, mowing the grass and digging graves. After college, he dabbled in accounting with two separate stints at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He went to law school and graduated with honors, but the corporate environment, cold and competitive, did not suit him. He returned to the cemetery in 2003 and has worked there ever since. "I feel like it's my calling," Mr. Martin said. "I feel like I can help people." It was with this sense of duty that he received the ashes of Mrs. Chaarte, gathered in a wooden box, coarse and gravelly, which arrived on the afternoon of March 10th, 2020, by FedEx. It's not for the dead, as we see different pet caskets here. Burials at Hartsdale Pet Cemetery tend to follow a similar routine. Families have access to a private viewing area where they can choose to display an open coffin. They bring flowers and memorabilia and ratty old toys. They read eulogies. Some funerals attract dozens of attendees. Often, a clergy person is on hand. People process grief in complicated ways, not only with sadness, but often anger or confusion. And Mr. Martin, over the years, has become adept at gracefully traversing these oceans of feeling. What we do, the rituals, it's not for the dead. It's for us. It's to help us get through the grief, Mr. Martin said. "My dad would always say, we can sell you a plot, we can sell you a casket, but if we haven't made you feel better, we haven't done our job." The job, Mr. Martin believes, contains elements of therapy. He has heard so many people over the years confess, with some guilt, that they struggled more with the deaths of their pets than with those of their parents. He has a theory on this. Pets are lifelong creatures of routine. They never grow out of it. They are utterly reliant on their owners, and their owners in turn build their days around these recurring rhythms, their lives lovingly enmeshed. Losing that routine is jarring. Mr. Martin himself experienced this sort of disorienting grief not long after Mrs. Charte's ashes arrived at the cemetery, when his family's cocker spaniel Violet had to be put down. He held her as she died and struggled for weeks afterwards with the loss. But there was no one around to grieve for Miss Chaarte. So on an unseasonably warm March day, Mr. Martin walked her ashes himself to a vacant plot in the cemetery. He watched as the foreman and supervisor plunged their shovels into the hard ground. In half an hour, they had a grave no more than 3 feet deep. Mr. Martin had no idea who this woman was, but he grew emotional as her urn was lowered into the earth. The men stood in silence, and Mr. Martin, so accustomed to comforting others, whispered some words of comfort to himself. It was not quite a prayer, more like a meditation on relationships, on companionship. What if this were a member of my family, he thought. What if this were me? The soil was restored. A small gray headstone was installed. As a business matter, Ms. Charte's file was closed. And yet his questions about her, about who she was, what she was doing there, still hung in the air. Why the heck am I not dead? So here's Patricia Chaarte on the right. Among the things Mr. Martin did not know was that down in Mexico, there was a small clique of friends who loved Miss Chaarte and missed her and remembered her fondly. She was a voracious reader, ace crossword puzzler, and heavyweight Scrabble player. She smoked constantly, Camels, drank enthusiastically, Dewar's with one ice cube, and was in love with peanut butter, sometimes straight out of the jar. She was profane. She had an irreverent streak. A talented artist and illustrator, Miss Chaarte was fired from a job with Hallmark, according to a friend, after designing a holiday card with a pop-up Jesus Christ inside, arms outstretched. He is risen, the card read. She was born Patricia Lou Bassett in Kansas City, Missouri on January 11th, 1928. Her parents divorced when she was a baby, and she was raised by her mother and later a stepfather. After graduating from Paseo High School in Kansas City with the class of 1944, she moved to New York City to cultivate her career in illustration. The city provided her a platform to find herself. She only realized well into adulthood, for instance, that she was gay. Around that time, a friend named Wendy Johnson became a love interest, then a longtime girlfriend. The two also became business partners, opening a needlepoint shop on the Upper East Side called Two Needles. In the early 1990s, Miss Chaarte and Miss Johnson retired and moved to San Miguel de Allende, a picturesque city about 200 miles northwest of Mexico City that had long been a haven for expatriates. Ms. Chaarte stayed busy in retirement. She became involved with a local animal shelter. She went dancing with a soft spot for the Glenn Miller Orchestra. She dressed plainly in slacks and big shirts, but sometimes donned a tuxedo for special events. She stayed engaged with American politics, diligently sending absentee ballots and keeping up with cable news. Once, while watching a segment on President Donald Trump, she threw a coffee mug at her television and shattered the screen. She was very spontaneous, said Isaac Uribe, a friend in Mexico. As Miss Chaarte grew older and her health declined, she became a begrudging yet diligent member of a local gym. Why the heck am I not dead yet, Janice, she would say in slightly more profane terms as a sort of ritual greeting to her trainer and longtime friend, Janice McDonald. Miss McDonald described Miss Chaarte lovingly as a curmudgeon. She had the hard shell of a New Yorker, but inside there was something else, something only her closest friends glimpsed in those moments when she let herself become vulnerable. It was a sadness born of something deep in her past. A picture and a revelation. So here's Janice McDonald, a longtime friend of Miss Chaarte, helped to settle her estate. She did not realize she had the answer to a question plaguing people thousands of miles away. On a summer night about a year and a half after Miss Charte's death, Miss McDonald was looking at a photograph of her friend on her mantle, beside a small jar holding 3 tablespoons of Miss Charte's ashes at her home in San Miguel de Allende. For months, Miss McDonald had been working with Mr. Johnson, the lawyer, to settle Miss Charte's will. Her estate was not enormous, but she had divided it with care and generosity. She left thousands of dollars each to five of her friends, as well as two former housekeepers and a former hairdresser. Though Miss McDonald and Mr. Johnson had never met, they had developed a warm rapport. Knowing that Mr. Johnson had never met Miss Chaarte either, Miss McDonald decided spontaneously to snap a photograph of the frame on her mantle and email it to him. Miss McDonald loved the picture, which shows Miss Charte's face contorted comically in exasperation. In her arms is a baby boy. And here's that picture. Whoops, sorry. I thought you might get a kick out of a photo of Patricia and her son, Miss McDonald wrote. The next morning in New York, Mr. Johnson read the email, saw the picture, and was dumbfounded. What? He said to himself. Soon, he and Miss McDonald were on the phone. He asked her if Miss Chaarte indeed had a son. She replied that Miss Chaarte did. He told her they needed to find him. He's dead, Miss McDonald said. She assumed Mr. Johnson had known all this. After all, she wondered, hadn't Miss Chaarte and her son been buried together? The tragedy of her life. Dana Bassett was born in 1954 and raised in Manhattan, where his mother, Miss Chaarte, fretted about keeping him out of trouble. Everyone said Dana Bassett looked just like his mother. He was born in 1954, though his mother, Miss Chaarte, had not planned on getting pregnant. She had no relationship with the father and decided to get an abortion. But when she arrived for her appointment, she found she could not go through with it. So she fled, literally, said Melanie Nance, a longtime friend. She decided, well, I'm just going to have this baby. Miss Chaarte raised Dana alone in downtown Manhattan, worrying always about whether she could keep him out of trouble. She showered him with love. It never felt like enough. That anxiety, in part, led her to marry a friend, Abner Chaarte, when Dana was young. She thought, according to friends, that her son needed a father figure in his life. The marriage did not last very long, but the friendship endured, and she kept his last name. Despite her efforts, Miss Charte's fears were realized. Dana, who kept his mother's maiden name, succumbed to the worst influences around him. He was 14 when heroin entered his life. Slowly, he slipped away. His mother tried sending him to rehab, but to no avail. A few years later, he died of an overdose. She never got over it, Miss Nance said. It was the tragedy of her life. Dana's life was cut agonizingly short. Miss Charte's crawled on, shattered. In her 60s, she prepared finally to leave New York, the place she had called home for most of her life. She would leave her son behind, yet she did not want him to be alone. So on January 23rd, 1989, she buried his ashes at Hartsdale Pet Cemetery. He would rest there with two beloved deceased pets as his companions. Miss Charte's partner, Miss Johnson, later purchased a plot there too. In Mexico, far from the locus of her imperishable pain, Miss Chaarte found moments of peace. But friends witnessed spells, whether over drinks or around certain holidays, when the delightfully rough edges of her persona would momentarily smooth over, her demeanor would quiet, and her mind would drift to the past. She hated Christmas, Mr. Uribe said, because it reminded her of him. Miss Chaarte suffered a stroke when she was almost 80. She lost the right side of vision in both eyes. A few years after that, she experienced complications from a pulmonary embolism. Her health was failing. She relied more and more on her friends. They took care of her after she was moved to an assisted living facility, shuttling groceries to her house. They would play Skip-Bo, a children's card game, which Miss Chaarte would punctuate with bursts of profanity, making everyone laugh. In her final years, she was diagnosed with cancer. She contemplated doctor assisted suicide, going as far as securing the necessary paperwork, according to Mr. Uribe, but did not follow through. Getting old is not for cowards, she told her friends. Near the end, she thought increasingly about her son. And though she was a vehement atheist, she often found herself openly pondering the afterlife. If I die, one of my dreams would be to be with my son, she told Mr. Uribe, where she was meant to be. Mr. Johnson hung up the phone and promptly wrote an email to Mr. Martin. Quote, you may recall that you buried the cremated remains of Patricia Chaarte at your cemetery last year at our request, he wrote. I was just told by a close friend of Miss Chaarte that her son's ashes were also buried at your cemetery after he died as a teenager in the mid-1970s. He added, if you have any records or information about that, I would be interested to know. Now it was Mr. Martin's turn to be surprised. Mr. Johnson passed along the boy's name, Dana Bassett, and Mr. Martin, who had previously only searched for the name Chaarte, went digging in the cemetery's records, eventually discovering that Mr. Bassett had been buried 3 decades ago. Mr. Martin left his office, made the short walk downhill to the gravesite, plot L832, and placed his hand on his chest. There on the grass was a small granite headstone. It was jet black. It displayed the names of a dog, Jackie Paper, and a cat, Puff the Magic Dragon. Above those was the name of the boy, Dana Brooks Bassett, and engraved below that was the name Patricia, Mrs. Chaarte's first name, in block letters. She was meant to be there. She had been there in a way all along. Mr. Martin felt a fluttering in his stomach. He felt heavy and light at the same time. He knew nothing still of the circumstances of Miss Chaarte's bittersweet life, the pain and the pleasure, the love and the loss. But the mystery that had shadowed him for nearly 2 years was finally resolved. Amid these new revelations, Mr. Johnson laid out a few options, including leaving the graves as they were. They had, after all, fulfilled the requests laid out in the will. But for Mr. Martin, there was only one thing to do. So on August 29th, 2021, 569 days after that first confounding phone call, he walked out of his office to finish, finally, what he had come to see as his solemn duty. On that overcast morning, Mr. Martin and 2 employees extracted Mrs. Chaarte's remains from the plot where they had been buried the year before. Together, they walked the ashes some 50 yards along an uphill path to the grave where her son had been waiting more than 30 years, and consigned them again to the earth. Mr. Martin did not know who Miss Chaarte and Mr. Bassett were. He did not know the particulars of their lives, but he knew they should be together. And now they were. Alain Delacquier contributed research. Andrew Keh covers New York City and the surrounding regions for the Times. More about Andrew Keh. So, wow. I mean, that really broke me up, guys, when I read that. And wow, I mean, that's pretty amazing stuff. So, yeah, my man Derek, it's a very sad story, but it is sad, but it's hopeful at the end. At least they were reunited, so it has a nice ending. I mean, I'm trying to process my feelings. I purposely didn't read this article fully. Like I read it once, but I didn't read it again until now. And of course, now I have so many questions for Ed, which we're gonna hopefully get answered when we do the walk and talk. And of course, we're going to see these graves and all that, but they ended up together. So at least there was a nice ending to, I don't know, it was a sad story, Derek. You're right. So I don't really have much more to say. It looks like there wasn't much going on in the chat. Again, I kind of want to keep this one short because what else can we say? about this other than having read it. And of course, we will now. I've been for some reason I've been saying of course like 500 times today. It's getting annoying. We should have a drinking game. Every time I say that, you guys take a shot. So anyway, um, so yeah, so put in the comments any questions you guys may have for Ed. We're gonna head up at a date in the future, near future, to get up there and do the walk and talk. And so let's make it that much richer an experience by making it interactive. If you have any questions or if you have any particular things you want to see related to this story, please put it in the comments. And of course, I will definitely be reading them and passing them along to Ed. So I think that's basically all we really need to say, because really in this case, the story spoke for itself. So anyway, guys, I will be seeing you at the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery walk and talk, hopefully within the next week. Keep an eye out for it. And until then, have a great time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.